So Iceland at kind of this stage, we still have the all thing. We still have there's no ruler of Iceland. There's no citizen is not the right word, but every kind of landowner has rights. And they have a say in the local politics. They could go to the all thing. They could make a case. They could follow laws. But we don't have any kind of things like a government. We don't have any authorities to punish. Say if you're a criminal, there's no one sending out a police force to get you. There's no one building roads or even say protecting borders, anything like that.
Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast,
the art and science of the Viking Age.
I'm CJ Adrian, Thing 1.
And I'm Terry Barnes, Thing 2.
And today we have another special guest, another subject matter expert who's going to be talking to us about...
a couple of different interesting things. The Sturlunga Saga and sort of the decline of the Viking Age. We talked a little bit in one of our other episodes about what caused the Viking Age, and now we're going to kind of bookend the other end of that and talk a little bit about had it all come crashing down, at least in Iceland in the 13th century. And that is recounted in the Sturlunga Saga. And so our guest will tell us all about all of that conflict and change.
And we're going to talk about rocks, right?
Yes. Did you see that?
I did. We're going to talk about the greatest Viking weapon of them all, rocks.
Right? Exactly. I thought you would enjoy that. I certainly smiled when I read about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's dive in.
All right. So welcome. Yes, Peter Konechny for talking about, kind of the end of the Viking Age. But as some of our audience probably knows, I know they do because I know some of those people, that Peter is the co-founder and editor of medievalist.net. And so this is the one-stop shop for all things medieval on the internet, the place to go. And he is joining us from where he works and lives near Toronto, Canada. So we've got an international thing going on here, as we often do. But one thing I wanted to do before we started, because we are going to talk about the Sturlunga Saga, and Peter is a military historian, and there's a lot of conflict and warfare in Sturlunga, so we'll get to that. But just, our podcast is Viking Age, and we have another episode about the causes of the Viking Age. And we've talked about, contextualizing the Viking Age for our audience as far as all right, the time period we're looking at, roughly what, most scholars kind of consensus mid 8th century to around the year 1100. And yet Sturlunga is after that. And so we're talking about largely probably the 13th century, right?
Yeah, we're kind of talking about that. This is, it's not say the events of the Viking Age, but a lot of our sources from the Viking Age come from the 13th century. Right,
exactly. Okay, and then and I have to say, there aren't hard and fast dates. I mean, I just gave those two, the sort of the beginning and the end. But I mean, we know that Viking Age stuff kind of existed a little before that and also after that. And I think this is very true when it comes to the case of Iceland, which is where the Sturlunga comes from, because they have their free state commonwealth in place, and it's still there into the 1260s. So in effect, we could say that the Viking Age really isn't ending until we get to that point for them. And so, and one of the things also that I wanted to kind of make clear for everyone too is that, so the title of our podcast today is about, why did Viking democracy fail? And a lot of times if people who know anything about Vikings, they're going to be going Vikings and democracy, it's this is kind of some brutal, savage warrior culture. What the heck do they know about democracy? But, they have been written about in that regard with what they start there in the early 10th century with the Althing and their parliamentary public assembly system and everything. And Jesse Byock, the scholar of Icelandic Viking Age, has called it a proto-democracy. And I think if anybody looks into it, you can see those things in what they were doing. But now what you're going to tell us about is just that kind of crashing down, right?
Yeah, this is like the kind of sad part of where like a society implodes from the inside, and you have a huge change to what happens for Icelanders. This is like perhaps the most defining moment they would have until the 20th century, until becomes an independent state yet again after
So,
World War.
yeah. Okay. So I mentioned that you are a military historian, and so I'm assuming that has a little bit to do with it. But why don't you tell everyone? So, what is it that got you interested in Sturlunga?
Yeah, like so I've always kind of had an interest in military medieval warfare. And I was kind of looking to see if we could find, stuff related to the Vikings, because, there was people covered like Battle of Hastings and some of the stuff that happens in Norway. But I was kind of looking, well, where else could they, fight, right? And I was like, I got interested in the sagas, the Njal Saga, Egil Saga. It was really interesting, but I was thinking, man, I wish there was more warfare in it. And, and I only had tangentially kind of seen like there was some problems in Iceland in the 13th century, and so I didn't realize there was any kind of like military history to talk about, right? And it's something that really wasn't covered very much. So once I actually kind of opened up these kind of sagas, I was like really shocked to see there was actual battles, that there was a kind of warfare that's happening that nobody was kind of covering. So like I, way back then, back in my earlier years, I like did a couple of papers on like the Iceland and warfare, and I thought it was really, really interesting. Is something I still love to talk about. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. Yes. So we'll, you've been writing about this for a long time and talking about it, as you said, but you did have something not too long ago on Mnet. And so we'll put a link to that in the description so everyone can get some more information about it.
I do want to jump in real quick and say I've never heard someone say that the Viking Age wasn't quite violent enough for them. So, we went, on this show, we had, Matthew Panesi, who completely ignored the Vikings from the monastic standpoint, to now a military historian who's like, they could have done more fighting.
It's funny, like we have a lot, a lot of the sources we have, like of wars in the 11th century, they're really kind of thin, right? In terms of like, hey, I want to know more about tactics and strategy and recruitment and things like that, and like how people fought, right? And you kind of look at like something you might see in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, like and the two armies went side by side, and after much fighting and honor, and this side was overcome, right? I want to know more, so
that was all. That's all the detail you get on that.
Yeah, and I want like, hey, like these sagas are a lot of fun for a military historian to like take a look at, just because Icelandic sagas are always fun to read, and when they're starting to talk about like how to actually fight each other, it was really, really fascinating. And I remember people like when I first kind of talked about it in conferences, people were like a little surprised and like like Iceland, these aren't real battles, right? This isn't actual military history, right? This is everyone kind of had assuming this is just feuds, right? But I'm saying, like, when is it a feud? A fight of a feud when you have like 2,000 people on the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
It's like what makes what's the difference between what you're seeing here in Iceland and what you're seeing in France at the same time?
Yeah. That is something that struck me actually when I was looking at that thing that you just posted not too long ago, and that is, I even actually remember making a written note about it of like, how many people are in Iceland at this point? And then I got down to where you said it's like 40,000 people or something, because it just kept saying, and then they gathered these many hundreds of men, and then this guy gathered these many hundreds of men, and I'm like, I spend a lot of time in Iceland. There aren't even many hundreds of them there now, And so it was just kind of like, where are all these people coming from? And that, I mean, to me, that's battles, that's fighting, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, like I once kind of did like a little calculation. I think if you compare like Iceland's population with say medieval England in like 1066, right? how much of a percentage of the population would be there? It would be like, if it was compared to England, it would be like 100,000 people showed up to the Battle of Hastings just on the English side, right?
Yeah.
So like this is something that takes a lot of the population. Like if you consider, like, this is representing every man, woman, and child, right? So I'm sure, like, do you remember being at the Battle of Orlingstadt? Yeah, we were there. So
Everyone in the country gathered.
Yeah. So it's not a battle anymore. It's just a family reunion.
Yeah. Well, Iceland does have that app, about what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Where you can swipe and see if the person you're about to date is actually one of your cousins. So, well, I mean, Peter, this is another reason, though, I'm saying that it makes me think of that it's more about the end of the Viking Age in Iceland because of the way, what you just mentioned there about, or the word you just said with recruitment. And as I was reading through it, it's definitely the case that they're still doing recruiting in the same way that chieftains were doing recruiting in like the 8th and 9th century, right? I mean, this is band of brothers type stuff. These are the guys who are the farmers in your district. These are people who you tend to know in some kind of personal way. So it's very informal in that regard, right?
Yeah, I think reputation makes a big difference, right? Where like this is, we've built up relationships, but this person is an honorable person and we need to support him. And you have the challenges where people are torn between, supporting one side or another, and they have, family members on each, right? And who you want to do. And so it's a real interesting challenge on, like, how the logistics of bringing in people to a place to fight and conduct campaigns.
So what, other than these numbers, what kind of things surprised you when you read into this?
Well, I guess, like, we should lay it out, like, how Iceland is, right? Like, this is a country, like, it's still in the 13th century, is very much as it is in the 10th century, which is kind of a collection of farms that are spread out along around the coasts of Iceland, right? There's no cities in Iceland. There is no not even what you would consider a village. You just have one farm, and then you would have another farm down the valley, and maybe another farm down the valley, and so on. You had, a couple of you'd have some places that have churches, and there was 2 bishoprics on the island, but these aren't major places. There's a handful of monasteries that exist, but this is a very much like rural and completely rural area. So you don't have any kind of massive sense of, like, a community, like, in that sense. Like, you don't have people just living together and coexisting. You just have isolated places and then these people have to gather and meet up every year or so at, like, the All Thing or at other meetings. So it's just that's a very big dynamic, and so different from, like, every kind of other kind of medieval warfare I kind of see.
Okay, well, maybe talk about some of those differences in more detail.
When we look at kind of the battles, say, like, if you do the campaign, you had these kind of the leaders would kind of recruit people from the kind of local area, but they recruit family members as well, and the retainers. They would bring them into a kind of a campaign, and then it would have to be a very quick campaign because they just didn't have supplies. Like, they didn't have food to kind of base to kind of like have a march and stuff like that on. So it's basically whatever they could capture along the way. But they would their aim was to go and raid like another of the enemy's farms, or 1 or 2, and see if they were always kind of hoping to capture or corner some of their enemies. But if they couldn't do that, they would have to kind of go and farm. And people could get away fairly easily in Iceland. Like, in Iceland, if you see someone coming, it's like, hey, I think I'm going to run off to the glacier. they
Go hide in the glacier.
oh yeah, we had a few things like people like they headed overland to like areas that you could wander off and like be in like no man's land and hide away. So it was always very hard. So you do have like kind of like a lot of this kind of like low level kind of raiding farming that is happening. But there's some cases where they're able to recruit quite a lot of people and actually meet another force on the battlefield. And a battlefield just happens to be someone's farm. So, and we don't have any castles. We don't have any defensive structures whatsoever. Like the best defenses people have are the actual house or a small wall, which is usually there to keep out sheep, right? You don't. So you'd have that. You'd have churches as well, which play an important role in some of these battles. But you have these descriptions where like it's like these people ride up to one farm. The other people are there waiting at the farm for them, right? And they go off and they they have to kind of like get ready and just like they'll know each other's coming for a battle. It's not like there's no one being surprised.
So. They're like, hi.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was going to say, before we get too far into the weeds of the mechanics of the battles, I would like to, for our audience sake, kind of paint a picture of where we are in time. And so with the Sturlunga Saga, we're talking about roughly between 1218 and 1274, right? If I remember correctly, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that's kind of the events. Like I think the saga kind of covers events from like the 12th century on. The Sturlunga Saga is actually a compilation of a bunch of different sagas that have a particular person has gone in, edited, and kind of put them together in a specific order to tell his tale. But they were all kind of roughly written in the 13th century. So they're very kind of contemporary to the events they're talking about. But yeah, so Iceland at kind of this stage, we still have the all thing. We still have like there's no ruler of Iceland. This every kind of there's no citizen is not the right word, but like every kind of landowner has rights. And they have a say in the local politics. They could go to the all thing. They could make a case. They could follow laws, but we don't have any kind of things like a government. We don't have any like authorities to punish, say if you're a criminal. Like there's no one sending out a police force to get you. There's no one building roads or even say protecting borders, anything like that.
Right, it's kind of like an Icelandic version of the League of Nations, right, where we have chieftains, Gothi, who unite to discuss the issues of the overall island. If someone's behaving out of line, they get an angry letter, but there's really no authoritative or like there's no authority or anybody who can enforce. Say it's kind of like a mutual agreement between everybody, a gentleman's club, if you will, as opposed to the government, the types of democratic governments that we have today. So we have at the end of the Viking Age, the all thing. This, if we can call it peace between the different, petty chieftains. In the article, you mentioned that they're called Gothi, right? And so as we approach the 13th century, I'm curious to know what themes were happening in Iceland at the time that then brought the entire island into this state of civil war in the 13th century, where they started fighting each other, where presumably, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the understanding that I have is before this period, they weren't fighting on that level. There wasn't the same continuous conflict.
Yeah, we all kind of like read Icelandic sagas. There's always like smaller conflicts, that at the very worst would engulf a neighborhood, right, or a little small region for a short time. But what I kind of see is as we get into the 12th century is we get like this concentration of kind of wealth and power between a few of these Gothi, these chieftains. Part of it is just like an accumulation of time, right? Because you can almost imagine like when Iceland gets settled in the 10th century, everybody that's coming there is probably poor. There's a couple of instances where there's a Norwegian noble or like someone from the Orkneys that is wealthy that comes over and settles the place. But in general, like these are all kind of very poor farmers that don't really have very much, right? But like over the time and centuries, through marriages, through being able to buy other farms, through just luck in some cases, certain families get more and more powerful. They get more and more wealthy. One of the one of the instigators is also the church. They're becoming a more presence. Like Christianity arrives in Iceland in the year 1000. There are actual like churches, and the only people that can really build them are these kind of chieftains. They're the only ones who really can afford. Hey, we're going to build a church on my land for everyone to go to in the neighborhood. So the chieftains by controlling those churches, they also control the tides that come in. So they're actually getting. I don't know if they're getting actual money, but they're getting resources. So these are things that are kind of coming in. And so you have a point where like about 6 major families have kind of emerged towards the end of the 12th century. They kind of have the kind of different areas that they seem to control. You kind of see like the kind of first kind of echoes of conflict happened just early into the 13th century, where there's a bishop, one of the bishops, his name is Gudmund Aronson. He gets the bright idea that he should help the poor. And he wants to basically tries to kind of set up charitable things so that poor people throughout Iceland are kind of coming over to be in like his area. And this actually annoys chieftains because these aren't people that are working as for the chieftains for nothing. These are people that are are finding a different way. So you can see how the chieftains are like, no, we don't want that. It creates some sort of tensions. It leads to actual a battle, one major battle, I think in 1202. The bishop actually wins, but after another year, he has to forced to flee Iceland. And I always kind of find this is really surprising. In Iceland, the churches kind of run out of town unless they're big supporters of these chieftains. While you go back to England, you have King Henry II has to kowtow to his dead friend Cromwell. So they and you can even here, you have these chieftains that are amassing power, and they're using it to. When you have that power, you can use it to, force against your opponents, right? One good example is when you go to the All thing, and they're trying to make a peace. If there's some sort of conflict, right? They go there to kind of negotiate and come to agreements and make kind of a peace. But if you're a chieftain, you can come in with all your men and all your resources and basically force your opponent to submit to your demands. On a couple occasions, I remember it's these chieftains said, "Well, the only agreement I'm going to make is if you agree to whatever I say as a deal," right? And they're forced to, and then they're like, "Okay, we're going to take half your farms now. We'll leave you with nothing. That's the deal we offer. We leave you just with your lives."
So this is really interesting because it sounds or feels to me like an extension of the last episode that we did with Dr. David Zori, where we talked about chieftains and the distribution of power in Iceland. He explained to us the importance of feasting, which is controlling certain resources within the community. And one of those resources was the church on the land, where the chieftain could collect both tribute from the people on the land and the tithe through the church. And so people could take positions of power in that manner. So it sounds like the distribution of power in Iceland changed with this consolidation with chieftains who are seizing power not only with neighbors and other farming communities, but also with the church and the allocation of certain resources, income, like a tithe, right? So and then it just boiled over into the consolidation of power, then created a couple of main players who then were vying for ultimate control of the island.
Yeah, the fighting, which kind of starts in the 1220s, it doesn't really start until the chieftains are starting to go after each other, right? Like they've kind of assumed a lot of control of their own little territories, but they at some point just wind up butting heads with their other chieftains. And, it's things like, hey, I want to take control of this inheritance, or I want this particular farm, or it may just be that their underlings somehow get into a dispute and they have to kind of support their underlings, and that and that kind of leads to the conflicts within these groups.
So as a medieval warfare historian in particular, is Iceland, is this theme echoed elsewhere in the medieval world around the same time? This concept of the consolidation of power then creating, actually being the driver of conflict.
It can be because like everywhere else there are kings, right? There are states, and these states will get into conflicts. Like we could look at like England and France, like they're fighting it out over Normandy. So we have these kind of conflicts, and these ones just happen. They're kind of on a smaller scale, but they, it's the age-old, reality of people wanting power and wealth, and they have to take it from somebody else, and authority. And the weird thing with Iceland is that you don't have a state, right? You don't have these institutions. There you have just people with wealth and power, and they don't have anything like backing them, like these, like Sturla Sigvatsson, like one of the kind of main players in this early time. Like there's nothing, he has no title, he has no grand claim to what he has. Like I own these farms, that's all. Like I have relatives, but he doesn't have like, hey, I have some sort of legal right to other places. You can't go off and say to the church and say like, hey, write me these letters saying that I should take control of these areas. So it's more fascinating, like, because when they start fighting, it's so personal.
So I want to back up just a little bit, though, and we should have probably done this at the beginning, but just because we're saying Sturlunga Saga. I mean, Sturlunga, just to give everyone a sense for those who don't know, I mean, this is based on the name of one of these powerful families. And some of our audience who are Viking Age enthusiasts probably have heard of the historian Snorri Sturluson, who wrote and lived until he was murdered in all of this violence we're talking about in the early 1200s. And so, and he was a chieftain as well. So again, like you said, Peter, one of the families, half a dozen families by this point in time who are involved in these problems. And I think, some of the stuff you were just remarking about with how they're acting towards each other. I mean, when I read about some of these stories, to me, it just smacks of like our modern idea of like a hostile takeover. They're just like, we want your land and we're just going to muscle in and get it. And good luck keeping it. And actually, oddly, it works out in their favor, like a lot. They end up just taking stuff from other people. So it's just open, naked aggression and power grabbing, like all over the place.
Yeah, they have no real justifications for what they're doing.
Right.
But there's nothing to stop them, right? And that is why a lot of people even this place in Iceland, they see that this thing is failing. Like the all thing, which was people hope would be something to resolve this, was like people, like certain leaders just didn't bother going. Said, well, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to go. So we're not going to solve it. The church can't really step in because you don't have any real power. Like most of the church officials belong to one family or another, right? The monasteries are tiny in comparison. They have no real, challenge. Not, like when we kind of like look at England, like, hey, we can talk about like how influential St. Albans was in running things. In Iceland, like I never hear what the monasteries do. They're probably just a handful of people, in the cold somewhere.
Oh yeah. Well, that's like everybody else. It's comparatively speaking, it is still just a handful of people in the cold somewhere, like in the entire country. But that, I mean, to me, that's also interesting. The part about, I don't know, it just kind of comes full circle to me, because at the beginning, in the early 10th century, like you said, when they established the all thing, and this is, their parliamentary body, their public assembly, their way that they're actually, again, this proto-democracy thing that we introduced at the beginning, they're doing it explicitly kind of as a way to reject what was going on back in Norway and the oppression that they were feeling at the beginning from, say, Harold Fairhair and things like that, right? So these powerful-ish chieftains kind of pick up and leave and go to do their own thing. They set up this completely different kind of governmental structure, and they're trying to, at least on the face of it, appears to do it in a way to curb violence. And then what ends up happening, like as this story is unfolding that you're telling, by the time we get to the 13th century, then you've got chieftains who, through their advocacy at the all thing, which is what was a big part of their role, right? I always tell my students, like, to me, I think of chieftains in that time as like lawyers now. These are the guys you want to engage with because maybe they can help you get a good settlement if you're in a problem with somebody else or whatever. But they got paid for those services, and they increased their power and their prestige and everything through being successful in that way. And then it's ironic then that they turn around and they actually build and use that power to destroy the thing that they were kind of, unique in creating, in a better way to solve problems without resorting to violence. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think you look at the all thing in this creation, it's a society built on consent. Everyone consents. Yeah. Everyone has a piece of the pie, right? Even if it's a small pie, like, so Iceland is like 40,000 people, right? Everyone, all males that are landowners, they would probably still be in a number in the thousands, right? And each at a point, theoretically, they all have a kind of a say, and they can all have influence. It's by the 13th century, these kind of forces of capitalism really have eroded away that, where instead of having a couple thousand people that could work, and together, and they all have a little piece of the pie, you have like 6 families that have most of the control, and they don't need to listen to the all thing. They don't. There's nothing to kind of stop them, right? So they can carry on, and it just, that leads to the conflicts. Nothing can hold these people back from fighting at a point.
For lack of better analogy, this sounds so much like the next great experiment in democracy, which was the United States. After the United States gained independence from England and created the Articles of Confederation, which was a complete disaster because the states all got complete autonomy, if you will, with no, basically that was the government they had in Washington at that time, or was it Washington, or was that in Baltimore? Mm-hmm. I can't recall, but anyway, we'll say as Washington. Then, if somebody watching is an American historian, they can correct me in the comments. But you had this situation where you had this government in Washington that had absolutely no authority to enforce any of the rules. It was all by consent, kind of the similar idea. And so, of course, the states started levying taxes on each other for trade, right? And then squabbling with each other. And then it got so bad that then you had this force of rebels, Shays Rebellion, that decided to march on Washington and take care of the whole thing, you know. And so it's to me, there are similarities here where when we're talking about the all thing is just being this group that come together to discuss issues. It only works by consent. And then and then because of human nature, we're all trying to get the upper hand on one another. And so it invariably will lead to conflict and that's why at the end of the Articles of Confederation, they had to call the Constitution Convention, and hence federalism was born, right? Because if we left the states to, govern themselves and play nice with each other, they'll beat each other up.
Yep, exactly. As Ari Thorgilson said, if we tear apart the law, we tear apart the peace, right? We can't,
right.
if we don't try to get on the same page and have some sort of consensus about how we're going to act and solve problems, we're just going to ruin the entire experiment.
You could also look at other similarities in the Italian city-states, say the 14th century.
Yeah.
A lot of them there are governments where a lot of the guilds, the leading merchants, quite a lot of people that live in the city have a say in that government, right? And they can continue on, but they may, for reasons of politics, start fighting amongst themselves. But there was also times where their challenges they face just prove too hard for them to work together as a community, and they often turn to bringing in a dictator, right? Someone hey, you need to rule over us because we're facing all these problems, and you need that single-minded determination. This one person to kind of, take over things and run things. Democracy is a messy thing, right? It's everyone needs their opinion, everyone needs their say. Everything moves slowly in a democracy. That's one of the big faults of it. And then people hey, it's not moving. Change is not happening quick enough. Let's bring someone with an iron fist to control things.
Ultimately, that happened in Rome and Greece. I mean, I feel like this is repeated often, in history.
Yep.
Because the Romans, who then went from being a republic to then an empire with an emperor who's the strong man to reel everybody in, or even the Greek city-states, right? We're all going to be nice to each other, and then the Peloponnesian Wars. So.
Yeah, but I mean, modern history. My God, Nazism, Mussolini. I mean, all of those people were we're utterly destroyed after World War I. We need somebody who can make promises and keep promises, and the strong man. Perfect entry point all throughout history.
Mm. Yeah, a democracy requires a lot of people to, it requires the entire population to really believe in it, right? And when people don't believe in it, because they don't think they're getting justice through it, or they think they personally achieve more through a different method, that can break down democracy really quick. And that's why I kind of see that happen, say, in Florence, at times, where it goes from a city state to being ruled by the Medici. And then, and here in Iceland, where, you have a system that theoretically, every farmer should have a say, becomes one where nearly every farmer is just following the orders of someone else.
Well, actually, with Viking Age history, though, I mean, this is not even unique, because at least according to the Russian Primary Chronicle, this is what happens with the Kievan Rus and the beginning of that polity over there is supposedly, I mean, it's not a democracy thing, but it's a bunch of, native, clans or whatever that are squabbling with each other. And so then they appeal to the Varangians to come and send somebody to lead us or rule over us, because we hear you all live according to the law. So it's people just, even if it's not a democratic type of experiment, it's people get to the point where they're just sick of conflict, right? And so then they're somebody come and bring the iron fist and bring some stability.
I do love that story, though, because to me it smells of self-justification on behalf of the Varangians, right? Well, they were so disorganized. They invited us. We were invited.
Hey, they didn't write the Russian primary chronicle.
No, but their descendants did, and the ruling class remained, descendants of the Varangians, right? So, I mean, it's the winner. To the victor go the spoils, right? And the version of history. So I always think of that as, that, what was it? Rurik, Truvor, and Sinead, or whatever, the three brothers. Yeah. And that was a hostile invasion. I mean, that was anyway, but yeah, but I see the parallel though, because that was their justification, was the squabbling, the infighting. There was no structure, there was no government, just like Peter, to your point, in Iceland at the time, there was no state. Yeah. So there was no organization.
Yeah, Iceland's Commonwealth, this, what we call the Commonwealth period, lasts over 300 years, which is, remarkable. Yep. I think part of it is like Iceland never really faces any kind of threat from the external. Like no one is sending a fleet to Iceland to take over the country. Like they don't have that kind of threat. And that's usually, what kind of forces a state to, kind of give up on like a pluralistic government, and is that they fear some sort of outside enemy.
Or at least in order to like start convening what resembles a military for defense. Yeah.
Well, so now that brings up a good point at the end, because isn't at the end of the Sturlunga Saga period, so the end of the 13th century, that's when the Norwegian king gets involved, right?
Yeah, like if we're running to the end of the story, there was a lot of talk, even as this is happening, that Iceland would be better if we had a king that could like oversee things and establish authority. The only king they can think of at the time is the King of Norway. That's the kind of direct connection by sea is from Norway to Iceland. A lot of these people have connections to Norway, and the King of Norway himself, Håkon III, I think. He's pushing this agenda, right? He wants it, and he's getting involved in Icelandic politics. First by supporting different families, like Snorri Sturluson. He goes to Norway. He lives there for a while.
Yep.
Yeah. When he's living there, he's living under the king's dime, right? And this happens quite a bit, right? Like there seems to be like an endless amount of people that are going and staying with the King of Norway for a little bit, and getting his favor and getting his support. And one thing, like Iceland probably doesn't have their monetary economy is probably terrible. Right? They don't have anyone, no one makes money, like mince money on Iceland. But there's still a need for that. Like there's still need for, like, say, trade goods from outside. It's not just a barter economy. So like the King of Norway can supply money, which is a really big thing. He is trying throughout this period to get somebody that will at least be his kind of voice in Iceland. And towards the end, like he is able to get, get like kind of the kind of leaders to kind of all fall in line, right, to him, where he can make one of them the like Duke of Iceland almost, right? And then, but the people generally, they have over a couple year period between 1262 and 1264, they actually vote and they accept a new law that makes the King of Norway the King of Iceland in its essence, and imposes a new law.
So was the Norwegian king instrumental in sort of stoking the fire of some of this conflict in order to be able to exploit it for his own, being able to finally come in and be like, okay, I'm gonna start the fire so that I can be the one who comes in and puts out the fire?
I'd have to kind of read through more, because like I can see it both, right? Like he obviously has his agenda and he is successful, but it's not like the King of Norway is coming to Iceland. It's not like he is sending any military resources to Iceland to impose as well. Like he is the one thing he has going for him is that the church, church officials see this is a good thing too, right? So the bishops, you have to remember the archbishop, the bishops of Norway, the two bishops of Iceland are theoretically under the auspices of the Archbishop of Norway, right? Or one of the archbishops in Norway. So you have those kind of church officials saying, like, hey, you know what you really need is you need a king. You need the system like we have elsewhere in Europe, right? That makes sense. What you have is wrong. So like there's this constant kind of peer pressure, influence. But it wouldn't have succeeded unless Iceland had gone to so much trouble on their own.
Oh, blame the victim. Come on. What the heck?
Yeah, I know.
They were having a good 300 plus year run. You just said it. Like, oh.
I know they did. Like, we have to, like this is a society that runs a long time and, like by our standards is really successful. And it's really sad to see it really collapse into, wars and some really vicious feuding, right? Like, one of the main characters is Geezer Thorvaldsen. He's one of the chieftains. He seems to be at like a high point, and then he has a wedding for one of his daughters at his house. His enemies take advantage of that to attack like the night after the wedding. They set fire to they surround it, they catch him unawares. They set fire to the place. Geezer escapes by jumping into a vat of whey. But there's his family burns up. Like there's a really heartbreaking scene where his retainers bring him the remains of his wife and daughter. Here is your this bone, this bit of charred bone is what your wife is, and I think it's something. It's certainly something. It's one of those scenes oh man, that's tough to read.
Yeah,
so.
Well, you know what that is? That's straight up Game of Thrones Red Wedding kind of stuff.
That definitely is, and so Geezer goes on the warpath for the next couple of years, but never really able to get everyone that he wanted to. So even him, he could just see this system we have is not working.
So for the mechanisms of fighting, CJ and I were over the moon, so happy to read about the fact that there were lots of rocks being thrown in this fight.
Yeah. That's the one fun, this fun part of warfare is this is, it's not kind of warfare you see on the medieval European continent with knights on horseback and archers and a military structure, right? You basically have farmers that that are being brought. They do not know how to fight, and they don't want to die, right? So a lot of the fighting almost has this kind of ceremonial quality, right? Because if people grab rocks from the ground and toss them at each other. And that's seems like all the battles seem to have that. I always kind of reflect that that's really not a harmful battle. The people can get killed. You can a rock can come and hit you, but in general, people can, stay behind. They can, stay safe in that kind of a battle. You're fighting, but not exposing yourself to that much danger, right?
Well, the first guy in your timeline, Colbin, whatever,
yeah, he does. Yeah,
dies from a rock. He gets hit by a rock and dies.
There are cases, but these Icelandic battles, the bloodiest battle has 110 people die on the battlefield, right? Which is not a lot, compare, there are medieval battles like that too, but, if you're a low level soldier, there's not much in it for you to gain. There's no, you could, strip the booty of somebody else and maybe take that, but they're not taking each other as prisoners. If you were captured, and surrendered, all right, just go home. Like that's your job. That's all you can do. It's the fighting is almost aimed at trying to get at the leaders themselves, right? Like it's like, hey, there's Sturla, go after him. We're gonna send the people to go after him directly. And Sturla only has like a few handful of men that will really want to stay and guard him till he dies, right? There's a lot more people that like, hey, I'm protecting you. Oh, wait, they're coming. I think I'll run away. So.
Actually, that reminds me of reading about, I think it was in your piece about getting sanctuary in the church, right? In the church chapels. Okay, so I've been to several of the recreations of those things in Iceland, and then also know of, excavated ruins of those things. Those structures are tiny. I mean, literally like a room, like I'm sitting in here, like US feet, maybe 10 by 10 or something. And so, I thought when I was reading that, it's like, no way everyone's getting sanctuary in the church. So they must be just putting the leaders in there, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, like right after Orlikstader, the biggest battle is Orlikstader. About 30 people go into the church at the end of the losing side, and the enemy surrounds it, and basically at this point there's a negotiation. We only want these people. We only want these people. The rest of you can leave if you want, and that's what happens. Where they don't want to storm the church because it's sacrilegious, and these are nominally Christian people, and they don't want to risk God's wrath. But at the same time, they're not going to let the other people get away. So you wind up, saying, hey, you and you and you can get it. You can leave. We won't harm you. I know your cousin. Your cousin is here on my side. He is vouching for you. Make safe, right? And it winds up there's like only 4 people left, right? And they just, all right, you might as well come out now because we're going to execute you. There's nothing that's going to save you. And they do. They walk out, and then there are beheadings. So on the church doorstep, more or less.
Oh, geez.
So I wonder around this time, how much of, so our conversation with Rainer Oscarsson and William Short, for example, we talked about the topic of drengar, which is, your good name essentially. And is that right? It's like your almost like a prowess. And this idea that, they had the glima, which is the, barehanded or unarmed fighting. So there was as far as my understanding goes, is based on that conversation with William and Rainer, there was a warrior culture present during the Viking Age. I don't know how far that extends. I mean, I don't know if that extends to the 13th century or not, but I'm wondering, because we're talking about an interesting dynamic here where, the chieftains are trying to raise troops, but they're not paying these troops. And so they don't have the same, if you go to medieval France, for example, the knights all know they're getting paid, and then they get a split of the spoils. And part of the spoils is capturing other knights and ransoming them. So there's not like a financial incentive to go fight for these people. So I wonder how much that cultural phenomenon of drengar, which is this idea of, it's this honor-bound warrior ideal, right? Played into this idea, played into this conflict, thereby allowing it to escalate to the level that it did. Because if they didn't have that, then nobody would be fighting, right? I mean, ostensibly, I don't know. I don't know that, but
yeah, I think there's definitely elements of being a warrior. None of these people go to war outside of Iceland by this period. None of these people are sailing out to to Norway and then they're like, hey, let's go raid, right? So they don't have practice in warfare. That's why these battles are so odd, right? But there are some that hey, I'm going to die with my lord, right? I'm going to fight it off. So you have these kind of men of honor, and then you have others that just hang back, right? They're there because whoever their chieftain is expects them to be there, and you can stay in the back, because these battles are often, one small group rushes at another group, right? It's you don't the leaders are putting themselves on the line more or less, right? And you have to be a good you have to like lead from the front, which is another reason why like most of the casualties tend to be the higher ranking people, right? So that's but yeah, it's interesting.
CJ, you and I have been doing this long enough now that we're starting to become of one mind. Because as soon as you were talking about that, I mean, that's what I was going to say too. It's like this idea that they engage in this kind of, to me, what's coming to my mind is this scrappy sort of like almost like schoolyard kind of thing where groups of people get together and it's a big intense, and then it kind of fizzles out, and you got the little nerdy hangers on around the edges, and you got the main proponents in the middle, and maybe some damage gets done there, but the rest of them are like, okay, we see what's happening here, we're just going to go home now or whatever. But that, the big deal for Viking Age culture writ large throughout is this whole sort of saving face, honor bound kind of thing, so there's just a whole other impetus to it, I think.
The sagas are written in such a matter-of-fact way that it's hard to gain like people talking about honor as particularly like the sagas aren't it has this bit of dryness to it, right? So you don't necessarily get like people's inner thoughts, right? That you wish you so that sometimes you would get with history of William the Marshal, right? Where like you learn a lot about his way of thinking, right? Here, it's you have people. We have lots of conversations, and reports on dreams and stuff like that. People have like dreams like, hey, I dream something bad's going to happen to me today, like, but
that's one of the things Sturlunga is known for, though, right? When you compare it to, like, say, the family sagas and stuff. Well, like you said earlier about the people who are actually writing it. Well, the one known author who was also a member of the Sturlung family, that these people are contemporaneous with the events that they're writing about, or at least know people who would have been contemporaneous. So there's living memory. And so the level of kind of social detail that is apparent in this particular saga is different than the others.
Yeah. One of the funny things, like when I kind of first, started reading this, the commentators of the Sturlunga sagas would say, "Wow, this is really unbiased stuff." Right. But now, like historians have kind of more and more worked on it and said, like, no, like this was written for a particular purpose. Like this is to support a person's point of view, right? Like, and even the way the saga is put together, there is like some thought into how it's being done, so that these aren't the unbiased recollections, right, of some sort of journalist. These are things that are being put together with thought in mind at how to tell the story that favors certain people, like Thord Kakali, right? Like he comes Thordor Kakali, he's like one of these heroes. He's like Snorri's nephew, I think. So he comes across like he's at one point this like has like 2 followers, right? Like his clan has kind of been defeated. He's on the run, but he's such a good guy that people start just gravitating towards him. People start coming in. He starts winning the battles, and a very famous kind of battle on the sea. Like there's one naval battle in this where like both sides like have collected ships once, and they're kind of looking. I don't know if they're kind of meant to. I think they were both trying to see if they could do a raid on each other's territory, but they wind up meeting in the waters. Of course, they piled their ships up with stones so they could throw stones at each other.
Of course they did.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Thord Kakali, his side is this much smaller side, but he's they kind of fight to a standstill. But because Thord was had the weaker force going into it, he is, he gets all the credit. And after a couple more years, he's able to like win a major battle. And then for about a couple of years, he's kind of like the de facto ruler of Iceland. So he's not able to hold on to it, but he gains that, like, like his honor is, and his abilities lead him to that, but he doesn't have the authority to stay in power.
Well, I think go ahead, CJ.
Going back to this concept of the mindset, right? We have a whole book here about the Viking mindset. First of all, I misspoke earlier. The Ostir, which is that's more of the prowess, right? So, and that's your good name, right? Anyway, I'm reading through this really quick, but your Ostir, so say. But then the Drengur is really what supposedly, according to this book, the Vikings are going for. But I'm just going to read a quick excerpt, and that's from Men of Terror. Once again, I refer to this book probably too often, but they talk about a Drengur was quite simply a person who could be trusted, a person who could be counted on to death, regardless of the situation, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the odds. So, going back to this question of recruitment in Iceland at the time, without the same incentives as in other places, I think it'd be curious to dive into it from this mindset point of view, as to explain some of the behaviors that were going on at the time. Again, going back to some of these battles, some of the leaders, and they're trying to get Ostir, right, and then how they recruit people is through Drengur, right, or something of that. And now I'm no expert on all these different Norse names and everything, but I do think that would be a really fun rabbit hole to go down for someone who's motivated.
Well, yeah, because of the guy that Peter was just talking about, that character. Yeah. I mean, the only way that, at least as far as most all the evidence that we have, take it for whatever grain of salt you want, but like the way that this kind of recruitment happens, again, I mean, this is very personal and very informal. And the only reason why somebody could amass, allegiance of any decent number of guys is because you have to have a reputation that precedes you. You have to be known as the go-to guy for several of these reasons that you're talking about, CJ, in order to get people to think that it's worthwhile to throw their weight in your, direction.
Right. I think, reputation, you can have a good reputation, but you can also have a really bad reputation, right? And like this, I always thought like this war, these fighting, this wars, it was really bloody, it was really dirty, right? You can see it in these executions, right, that happen like on the battlefield, right? There, like in some, there's this glee in, destroying another person, right? That that you might not get in like other kind of medieval warfare. Like you don't have the honor, right? The honor comes, like especially like between people that are of their own elite class, and they go off and they're like, let's not just kill the person, but strip them, and then use their weapon to, they take one guy's weapon, they use it to kill his two sons, just for the heck of it, right?
Although that's not unusual, right? I mean, other honor-bound cultures like that. I mean, like medieval Japan, I think, has a bunch of that kind of pretty vicious behavior, because that's just about power and dominance, Yeah. I mean,
but like I could just see how people just like, hey, I'm going along with this so I don't die, so I want to be, I'm joining my side because I don't want to be, either I'm with them or against them, right? So it's, every farmer has to make their own case, right? Like, and like some people say like, hey, I'm going to stay out of this, and there are some, like there's attempts at, some people want to be broken peace, but others, I think, just want to be on the winning side.
Those dudes moved to Greenland. They're like, we're out of here. Let's just stay away.
Yeah, Greenland. That's a good place. That seems. what could go wrong in Greenland, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, I have to say, like with
gone.
with this saga, like you said, kind of at the beginning, now we've been talking for a little over an hour or whatever. That it kind of makes me sad because even when I'm teaching this stuff to my students about like the beginnings of the all thing, to me it just seems like so like cool, right? And just so interesting and so counterintuitive for what we think of Vikings to be like, that they're actually going to make an effort to sort of be decent human beings and not resort to violence to always solving their problems. And it's like they managed to kind of hang on to it against the odds. And then like, this is what they end up doing at the end. And it's like their own dang fault. And it all just kind of falls apart. So like there's that part of me that's sad about it, but then there's the historian brain where it's like, yep, and here we are again, just replaying another script that human beings just keep replaying on and on and on throughout time.
Like I did one trip to Iceland, and I was kind of hoping to, hey, I want to hear more about this part of the history. And I found it quickly that like that is not something that is talked about in Iceland. Like they're very happy to talk about, hey, this is what the Njal and Egil and Laxdela, and like here's our saga and us settling. But you don't get very much about, hey, how Iceland falls apart. And even like historians, very little kind of bits of historians have been covering this topic. It's just surprising, like, because it's such great sources, and even we know where some battlefields are, right? But this is something that like people, I think for the reason is that it's a sad kind of thing to see this end, and it ends like the Icelandic state ends in a whimper, right? Like you end by submitting to a king that will never step forth on your land, on your island, right? Yeah. And
only to submit to another one like 100 years later, and then that submission lasts for like 700 years.
Iceland winds up like when they get independence, is independence from Denmark, so so it's a very kind of like I think people don't necessarily want to cover it, but it's such a fascinating story to tell, and it has a lot of lessons, right? So
it's also, I think it speaks volumes that we have a lot of the literature written about the Viking Age, specifically about the settling of Iceland and the first Icelanders, and that was written during this tumultuous period, almost like they sensed that their doom was approaching. Like they could tell that what was happening at the time was not going to end well, so they wanted to document things while they still could, before they essentially imploded. And like Snorri Sturluson writing, and he even wrote about the mythology and so forth to try and preserve the old culture, because that's pretty calamitous when you have an island with 40,000 people and you're putting together armies with thousands of people. I mean, demographically speaking, that's like like you said, it's like the big family reunion. We're all going to kill each other today, and so yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that struck me was like, I would look at the saga like Njal Saga, and there would be many cases where there like the violence, but the two sides would come to kind of peaceful agreements, like Njal and Gunnar, right? Like when we're Njal and Gunnar, their wives are like sending out the people on their side to kill each other, and Njal and Gunnar like, oh, my slave got killed by your slave, we'll just make an agreement, whatever you think is fair, and I'll just a couple of bucks, and everyone is, they're happy, and like, and you have a lot of these law cases, right? Like, where things are, it's almost kind of portrayed as comedy, right? Like, at least like, let's resolve things at the law. And this is happening at a time when that very aspect of Icelandic system is failing, right? So it's like people are saying, hey, remember, we could do better. Like in our past, we could make agreements, we could settle things peacefully, we could stop feuds, And now, like, and they're trying to here's an example, but that doesn't, what they're saying doesn't seem to resonate.
I think it's also a similar, human propensity for thinking about the golden age. It's like the time when we were at our best is always some, time in the past. Maybe there's a little bit of that to it too.
Like Iceland. There's always this a fascinating culture, right? Like I enjoy it. Like I have to kind of think of more ways. I'm kind of waiting to actually see when there's a few chronicles from Iceland that they're just being translated now. I wish I'd like to see what the kind of I guess the monasteries thought of all this, right? And hopefully there's some details. Hopefully they're not like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. They had a war, or this volcano blew up this year, and that's all.
Well, hopefully when you went to Iceland, one of the first things you recognized immediately when you got off the plane and saw the topography is that, this is why they threw rocks at each other.
That's so funny.
That's all there.
It's a wonderful place to visit. Like like Iceland is just incredible, like for a natural beauty to look at. But it just seems to be just oozing with history.
Yeah, it is. That's why I love it. I'll be there in 2 weeks.
Oh, nice.
Woo-hoo. So, we should probably maybe unlike the Icelandic Viking Age, we'll end this podcast with a bang and not a whimper, and talk about what are you working on, Peter, and is there anything that you'd like to talk about project-wise, or anything you'd like to promote?
Oh my gosh, I do so many things but like with medievalist.net, we're always constantly putting out material, articles. I have a ton of writers. I don't get to write too much, but we have writers. We have a few podcasts under our belt. Like if you like medieval military history, we have Bow and Blade with Kelly DeVries and Michael Livingston. We have the medieval podcast with Danielle Sobolski. We have our own YouTube channel. We're trying to do everything. One of the new things, and this very well, is that Terry is we're creating online courses. So and I'm really happy to be working with you to do that. Like you've had your course on the Viking Age. This is something again we're going to be doing fairly soon, depending on when this podcast comes out. And we have kind of a lot of plans on to have ways that people that are interested in medieval studies can learn from each other, tell their stories, right? Like whether it be as a book, as a podcast, as courses, or just articles. So medievalist.net, I try. It keeps me busy. It keeps me from running amok.
Well, that's good. Yeah. And thanks. I'm glad to be working with you on the online classes too. I think, our podcast, this one we're talking right now, will be coming out, CJ, like probably tomorrow or something.
Yeah. So, as soon as I get it edited,
Yeah, exactly. And then so that, class will be hopefully starting in April. But I did just see an email this morning from one of my students that I had them read an article that was, linked up from MNet. And they said, by the way, thank you for referring us to medievalist.net. There's a lot of good stuff there. And it's like, oh, well, good. Because you're right. There is, if you're interested in the Middle Ages. So
isn't there always?
Medievalist.net, so about going to turn 15 years old in September. So, I've been thinking about it, reflecting on back. I think we've had a bit of a nice influence, like on people looking at medieval studies, learning about medieval history. So I'm very proud of it. So.
Yeah, I was at breakfast this morning with some folks, and I brought up that we're going to be recording this podcast, and one of the people there, and nobody there's a medieval historian or anything like that, but just through social media, medievalist.net. Oh yeah, I know those people. Yes, so it's a wide reach. But I do want to interject. Speaking of going out with a bang, I did want to poke a little bit of fun because I was reading an article on medievalist.net. Particularly about the Vikings, and I'm going to share my screen real quick
Uh-oh, is Peter going to get in trouble?
Oh no, yeah. What horrible thing that I
It's okay. If it's really that, no, it's funny. So for those of you who don't know, I am the administrator for Viking memes, the original one from like 12 years ago. And it's still going strong. I got like 20 something thousand people on there, which is fun. So something popped up on the article.
Oh,
I hope you can all see it.
Oh yeah.
It's great. I was reading through, and one of the ads is basically saying, I was reading an article about slavery in the Viking Age on medievalist.net. And here's the ad that I got. Ukrainian women. Of course, I texted this to my wife and I said, should we buy one?
Oh, geez. Wow. Well,
it's
like
just so odd. You never know what you're going to get with some of the ads, but I just had to laugh at the irony behind this, because it was like, the ad generator doesn't know what I'm actually reading, I don't think. But that's where the Vikings went for their slaves. So,
Oh, jeez. Oh, man. Well, that's a good segue there too, because actually in 2 weeks we're going to be talking with Dr. Leszek Gardella about Vikings in Slavic lands. So there you go.
Oh my gosh! So we'll get into the deep end on that one.
Yeah, he is great. Yeah.
Nice.
Medieval sagas, it's funny, like, some of the ads and, things people see on our site, like, I don't control that. But, like, there's really nothing I can do. But, it's a fascinating, like, trying to run a media company these days, like all the little moving parts, like even today has been meetings on this, that, and and I want, like, man, I haven't had a chance to write in like a couple of days. They like write anything, like, or post anything new on the site, just because it's the wonderful thing, right? Like, like, if you like, I have a little bit of entrepreneur in me, so just trying to do that. It's a really fascinating world. So, and just like Iceland, medieval Iceland. So
nice.
I love what I do. So
good. Well, keep doing it, because it's good stuff.
All right. Well, thanks, Peter, for coming on the show. I guess we'll wrap it up there, and we'll have a couple of links added to the description, the ones that we brought up.
Yeah.
And then for you and me, Terry, we'll talk to everybody on the next episode in 2 weeks.
Yep. Sounds great.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.